When you say nation, you talk about land. Our land is Africa. That's undeniable. This land is not our land.
That what Frantz Fanon's theory, psychological theory, is that we're in a post-colonial psychology. And what he calls that is an auto-destructional stage, which is the oppressor will oppress for so long that the oppressed no longer have to be physically oppressed. They do it to themselves automatically.
I'm black. Do you hear me, man? Do you understand? I am black. I'm a nigga. You understand me? I was born black, I live black, and I'm gonna die probably because I'm black. Because some cracker that knows I'm black better than you, nigga, is probably gonna put a bullet in the back of my head.
Hey man, it's like this, man. It's like, you know, it's like it's revolution time, man. There's no questions asked. Revolution is here. You know what I'm saying? We the youth, we the young. It's time for us to break loose, you know? We don't have no freedom, no rights, man. We slaves right now. Everybody's still a slave. That's what they told us today. In other words, you still a slave. No matter how much money you got, you still ain't shit. So, you know, it's on, just like that. Just like
are really ready and willing to pay the price that is necessary for freedom. Our people will always be walking around here second-class citizens, or what you call 20th century slaves.
What price are you talking about, sir?
The price of freedom is death.
What's the figure?
I mean, what are you in this for? You want power, you want revenge, you know? What is it?
It's simple, Willie. I just want to be free.
Hey, peace to the family. Welcome to another Blueprint for Black Power study session. I am Kimba Jodre. I am the host of this study session, and we'll be continuing the reading of Dr. Amos N. Wilson's The Blueprint for Black Power. Boom. This book right here that everybody should have in their possession. This book, The Blueprint for Black Power, Moral, Political, and Economic Imperative for the 21st Century, written in the 20th century. I always like to say that because this is someone who was looking toward the future, putting together a plan, a strategy, a blueprint for Black people, for African people to follow in order for us to attain sovereignty, in order for us to liberate ourselves from colonial conditions, from this colonial relationship that we have. So here we are in the 21st century, and many of us are still not familiar with the work. But it is my objective to make as many people as familiar with Dr. Amos N. Wilson's work as possible, as well as study, as well as examine the work so that we can not only theorize about it and talk about it, but to actually put the blueprint into action. So I want to say peace to everybody out there. Peace as always. Appreciate the support. Make sure that you like and share. Make sure you like and share this podcast, this book club. Book reading. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure that you subscribe to our channel. This is We Charge Colonialism. This isn't the only podcast we do. We are on Saturdays as well. Myself, Natasha, and Frank do a weekly podcast on Saturday, and we are currently reading Stolen Black Labor by Omali Yeshitela. So if you want to join that discussion on Saturday at 10 o'clock, we just started that book last Saturday, so we're still in chapter 1 of that reading, and you don't want to miss that. We also do a political prisoner podcast. Organizers from the D12 movement, December 12th movement out of Brooklyn, New York, hosts that podcast. And you can check that out throughout the week. Subscribe to the channel so that you know when those episodes are going to air. So with that being said, man, I want to, again, thank y'all for tuning in. Try not to keep y'all too long this morning. But it's been about 2 weeks since I did this study. Been really busy with African Liberation Day, Malcolm X Day, a lot going on. So I'm glad to be back and doing this. I'm actually going to share my screen because I do have PDF, not of the whole book, but I had made some copies of the first 5 or 6 chapters, and I think I'll continue to do that. I could have done it for chapter 1, but moving forward, I'll start to put the reading on the screen. so that you guys can read along with me. But make sure you have this book in your possession as well. So let's do that. All right. So last time we left off on page 32. So I read up to this point on page 32. For those people who are just joining us, you can definitely go to our past videos and check out the Blueprint for Black Power series so that you can catch up with anything that you have missed. So I'm starting from this paragraph, the first paragraph on page 32. Let's get into it. All right. So in capitalistic America, since with property comes power, it stands to reason that if African Americans are to obtain substantial and sustainable power, they must obtain control of substantial property and with it, substantial economic power. The rapid accumulation and applied organization of property and wealth by any means necessary must become top priority goals of the African American community if it is to maximally ensure its own future survival and well-being. The accumulation and organization of property and wealth as means of securing their survival, enhancing their well-being and power, are imperative for immigrant groups entering and establishing themselves in the United States. Adherence to these imperatives are in good part responsible for their remarkable economic progress compared to the relative economic stagnation of African Americans. Yeah, but part of this too, there's a couple of things right here I want to touch on. One with immigrant groups that have historically come into this country, they have been used and weaponized against the African population or the Black population in America. And that's what capitalism does. Capitalism weaponizes its own population against each other. And so when they are bringing other people into the country, part of that is with the capitalist exploitation of workers. They're able to bring people into the country and pay them at a lower price, or use them to bring in more resources. Even if they're bringing in people and people who migrate to this country, even if they are business owners, the exploitation, usually what happens is a lot of these businesses come and they exploit the vulnerable population. And the most vulnerable population in the United States has historically been the African American population. Coming into the beginning as colonial subjects, as enslaved people in colonial America, there has been this history of creating or relegating African people to the bottom class in the United States. And so with that being said, other groups have been able to position themselves or build themselves off of the backs of African labor as a result of the design of this system. So I just wanted to make that point too. You know, with other groups, they can be looked at as examples of what we can do in regards to organizing ourselves economically. But we have to also understand why they've been able to do what they have done. And Africans who have a history in this country have not been able to do that. Well, actually, we have. Let me say that we have been able to do that, right? But because the system has been designed, it's the reality. Some people, don't want to face that reality, but it has historically been designed to keep Black people in a position in an inferior position, in a position of subjugation in relation to white America. I think that's very important that we make that point, or that we understand that point. The other thing is that economic power is important, but it can't be the end all be all. Like, that can't be the end game for African people in the States and worldwide. We're going to have to secure political and military power as well, because we're going to have to protect ourselves and defend our interests against colonizers, against the imperialists. Because even with economic power gain if we don't have the infrastructure to be able to protect those institutions, to protect the economic power that we have attained, then it can be easily taken away from us. I mean, we had economic sovereignty in Africa, and what happened, right? So to prevent a repeat of what has happened to African people historically, we're going to have to build some sort of defense against any sort of imperialism, because you know, at the end of the day, when we think of nations, the building of nations, all nations, well, if you look at the history of nations, you're looking at the history of conquest. You're looking at a history of imperialism, right? And so that, but with that being said, the building of the Black nation, the objective of independence isn't to oppress and exploit other groups of people. That's going to be the difference. See, the building of our nation is to overturn the oppression and exploitation of Black people. But we have to be very conscious in building a system that does not necessarily do the same thing as Europeans have done historically against other groups of people. So I'm going to continue on. I just wanted to, because that kind of stuck out to me. So a review. Just make sure my sound is good. A review of tables 2.1 and 2.2. And I'm going to look at these tables as well at the end. But I'm just going to keep reading through right now. A review of tables 2.1 and 2.2 indicates that, contrary to the Horatio Algiers myths and the myths of individualism, where the rugged individual gains fame and fortune through frugality, thriftness, dogged determination, and creativity, or through the convenience of marrying into wealth, or through the convenient receipt of a huge helping hand from some doting wealthy benefactor, the principal means by which white men gain wealth and power is through aggressive, ruthless, race-based organization. The history of white American capitalism and wealth creation and a generation of near tyrannical white political economic power is replete with the organization and violent operation of white race-based cartels, syndicates, rings, private armies, gangs, and thugs. The captains of American industry, by all sorts of nefarious and violent means, literally organized or seized control of federal, state, and local governments in order to cede to themselves all types of special benefits, protections, and keys to the public treasure. Government, business, and the military, those entities which have permitted white America to dominate the national and world industrial complex from their inception to this very moment, are essentially exclusive organizations and the special preserves of white male ruling elite and of white men in general. Now, you know, this is important because this speaks to what I was just talking about in regards to economic power, but making sure that we also are building dual and contended power in other aspects of society, such as political, military, education. We have to build dual and contending power. The same institutions that are used to colonize and oppress Black people, we have to build counter institutions to be able to defend Black people against that oppression, that exploitation that has been taking place, right? That's why we charge colonialism media is very important. You know, what we're building here and making sure that we are connecting and building with other media outlets so that we are able to concentrate our power or concentrate our actions and behavior to be able to counter anything that goes against what we're trying to do as Black people who are struggling to attain power. And it's not as if all people are doing that, but it's our objective to get the majority, as many African people as possible on the same page, so that we can be able to attain liberation. And we have to be clear too. I mean, at the end of the day, I know there's a lot of people, and most of us that listen to the Blueprint or read Dr. Amerson Wilson, and we understand what colonialism is, imperialism, capitalism, how these are used, these isms are used against the interests of Black people, are used to subjugate us. We understand what the objective and goal is, but a lot of people really, you know, they're, you know, working against their own interests. A lot of people who go to work they have no intention on dismantling the system. So even though we're caught up, a lot of us is caught up in under, under these colonial institutions, and we may go to work and so forth. We're constantly trying to strategize and detach ourselves from the institution. So it's a major difference there. But really quick though, going into this is a good book by Charles Mills called The Racial Contract. And I'm going to stop here and then go back to this point. But there's something I want to read. I kind of just want to expose the book to you guys, as well as just like read a paragraph from this book. It's by Charles Mills called The Racial Contract. Yeah, because I don't want to. It's a lot in here too to discuss, but I don't want to go back and forth. But let me read this paragraph again. This is The Racial Contract, Charles Mills, and he's talking about this racial contract that Europeans have created. Because if you study any philosophy or even political science, there's talks about these political philosophers such as Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, to name a few. These people talk about this social contract that has been created in society. So there's this contract where you have members of society or people who come together to form a society. They agree to give up some of their rights, their natural rights, to forge this society, and so they enter into a social contract. But the racial contract, pushes back. It gives us another perspective of the social contract, because the African was not included in that social contract. There was a social contract amongst Europeans, but there's this racial contract when it comes to the Black community. So in the social contract, we're excluded. So there's another contract that has been created, and that's the racial contract. And I'm just going to read this couple paragraphs, and then go back to the blueprint, just to give you an idea of what the author is really getting at in this book. So he says, by contrast, the economic dimension of the racial contract is the most salient, foreground rather than background, since the racial contract is calculatedly aimed at economic exploitation. Right? So the whole point of establishing a moral hierarchy and juridically partitioning the polity according to race is to secure and legitimate the privileging of those individuals designated as white persons and the exploitation of those individuals designated as non-white subpersons, right? So there are other benefits accruing from the racial contract: far greater political influence, cultural hegemony, the psychic payoff that comes from knowing one is a member of the Herrenvolk, what W.B. Du Bois once called the wages of whiteness, but the bottom line is material advantage. Globally, the racial contract creates Europe as the continent that dominates the world. Locally, within Europe and the other continents, it designates Europeans as the privileged race, right? So this is this racial contract. Is this exclusion of Black people, from social or from society, or from the original social contract, right? So there's one set of rules for Europeans, and there's another set of rules for African people. So I'm going to read this last paragraph. It says, the challenging of explaining what has been called the European miracle, the rise of Europe to global domination, has long exercised both academic and lay opinion. How is it that a formerly peripheral region on the outskirts of the Asian landmass, at the far edge of the trade routes, remote from the greatest civilizations of Islam and the East, was able in a century or two to achieve global political and economic dominance? The explanations historically given by Europeans themselves have varied tremendously, from the straightforwardly racist and geographically determinist to the economic egalitarianism in society. So different political interpretations of the initial moral egalitarianism can be advanced, but the general excuse me, but the general background, I was drinking water, a lot of it, but the general background idea is that the equality of human beings in the state of nature is somehow, whether as equality of opportunity or as equality of outcome, supposed to carry over into the economy of the created social political order, leading to a system of voluntary human intercourse and exchange in which exploitation is precluded. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Again, I wanted to expose y'all to that book. Definitely look into that. Again, that's by Charles Mills. But we have this racial contract that's created under the system of colonialism, because at the end of the day, it is colonialism. It's settler colonialism. Share my screen again. And so you have a society that's being built, but there has to be all of these other institutions. There has to be this racial contract, but at the end of the day, we're talking about laws that are put in place that have been used, whether you're talking about de jure or even de facto laws that have been put in place to be able to place Black people at the bottom of the social ladder. And so that is what is happening here. And that's what Dr. Amerson Wilson is getting to in this book. Let me read this last paragraph, and then I want to go give you an example of, so mind you, we talked about the racial contract, we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about exploitational oppression. So what does this really look like? And when I show you this chart, we'll get an understanding how for 400 years, the impact that this contract is going to have on Black people. I'm going to use that racial contract today, that concept. So the American economic system, as is its system of government, its military and paramilitary system, as well as its religious and media systems, the key power systems of any modern society, are systems organized by, of, and for white men versus Black men, white people versus Black people. Again, going back to that contract, and these systems are not the creation of Adam Smith's mythical invisible hands guiding self-interested, self-serving individuals into the coincidental building of an equilibrated market economy, free market, and democratic government, right? Because again, from a European perspective, when Adam Smith is talking, or even Karl Marx, when these people are talking, they're talking from a European lens, right? And so these the way that they're imagining society, they're not even incorporate, or Black people are not even considered when they're talking about, and not to say that they're not thought about, because they are thought about, but when they're considering these societies and the way that it's operating, one thing that we have to understand, the way that is operating and functioning for white people, they're examining how white society is functioning. For the enslaved African, they would have a different view if they were writing about how capitalism operates or how colonialism operates. Their perspective is going to be clearly different because they are part of the oppressed class. When you're coming from the oppressing class, the bourgeois class, you're going to have a different, even the white worker is going to have a different perspective, right? Because the white worker is able to advance, sit on the pedestal of the African workers. So that's something that we have to be very conscious of. And we're going to talk about that. If you join us on Saturday for Stolen Black Labor, that's something else that we're going to build on. So these systems, there was another point I wanted to make too here, but it'll probably come back to me. These systems were and are constructed and operated by highly conscious and deliberate men well aware of what they are about and what it is that they want to achieve, the holy grail of power and the perks of power. These organizations and systems can only be neutralized or defeated by counterpoise organizations and systems and the oppositional consciousness which informs them, right? So these are people at work, and in order to dismantle the system, it's going to take people at work. It's going to take Black folks that's going to organize and create these institutions, right? Society isn't just, when we think of a system, isn't just running itself. It's not on autopilot. It's not on autopilot. There are people who are in positions of power who are consciously making decisions to keep Black people in a particular position within the society, in an inferior position. I'm gonna use the concepts that my mentor used, or he uses in his research. He talks about the most favored position and the inferior position. And the most favorite position is the white position. And that's why you don't even have to be white, right? As we can see, there's a lot of people who have been able to put themselves in the most favored position that have historically not even been considered white. There's people who are able to check that white box, right, and be in the most favored position. Black people can't check that box. You know what I'm saying? Well, we got some try to pass. But overall, though. So let me and peace again to the chat. Oh, wait a second. I'm seeing something in the chat. What? You haven't read anything about that Wilson yet? Yes, brother Nkrumah, Kaka Nkrumah, and Ndugu Nkrumah. You have to. I'm telling you. So I'm going to pull up this chart again. Going to this. I think I gotta. Let me see. Can I rotate it? Here we go. All right. So remember, we're talking about colonialism. But colonialism, any group of people can be colonized. Colonialism existed way before African people were colonized by Europeans, right? But the difference in the type of colonialism that African people have been facing is that there's this race-based colonialism. And that's why we're, struggling again. This is, one of the reasons we have to separate ourselves from the system, because the system has been based on privileging white people. And so they have been able to capture the economy. And it's going to be a very difficult thing. As Malcolm X, man, he told us in the message to the grassroots, land is the basis of all independence. The European has been able to capture not just the land, but every aspect of all the life-sustaining institutions, everything that you need as a human being to survive, as in whole has been for the last few centuries have been under the control of Europeans, right? And this is something that we have to get back, and we have to be clear, like, these people aren't just going to give it up peacefully, but hopefully we can be able to capture it without losing as many lives as possible. So we have to be very strategic in the way that we move. With that being said, let me get to this chart. So take a look at this. Is one of anytime somebody comes up and they talk about society, they talk about racism and how racism doesn't impact society and so forth, or these are things from the past. I want y'all to show them this chart, and because this, as it says up top, America's long history of 100% racial quotas in favor of whites. Because when you look at this, you will understand why today white people control the wealth that they control, and Black people do not control that wealth, and why we're still in the position that we're in today. It's because of this history, and this is a primary reason why we have to detach ourselves and separate ourselves from the system, because they have already positioned themselves, put themselves in a position where they can sustain their power. They can sustain their power based off of this history. And so it will take us another 400, 500 years to even make a dent. I still don't think even in that time, underneath the system of white political economic domination, that we'll be able to capture the economy. Why would they let that happen? As members of the same society, why would they even let another group of people overpower them legally, by legal means? Something, I think we should think about. All right, let me get to this. So 1675, we're going back to 1675. And so I'll go through this chart, and then we're going to close, and then we'll come back probably sometime this week. So in 1675, Massachusetts Bay Colony seized plantation rights in 6 square mile tracts to worthy individuals. The population of the colony included black slaves as well as free blacks. Neither were treated as worthy individuals eligible for land grants. So we can see in Massachusetts, those blacks who were there, because of law, they were not able to buy any land. They weren't considered worthy individuals because they were enslaved people, right? So they didn't have access to the same things as the free white population. In 1683, Maryland and Virginia established 50-acre land grants to settlers who paid their own way across the Atlantic. Blacks were given a free ride in slave ships and thus were not eligible for grants. I mean, blacks were given it, they were enslaved. You know, we didn't even want the free ride, right? Let alone, pay for the ride. But again, this is an example of how black people were excluded legally from being able to have access to the same things as free whites. So because they were transported here as enslaved Africans, they were not eligible for these grants. That's in 83. 1785, the federal ordinance of 1785 authorizes the sale of 640-acre tracts to settlers for $1 per acre. As slaves, blacks were legally prohibited from owning property. Again, this disadvantage. So when we talk about white privilege, we can go all the way back to the 1600s, man, right? We can go back to 1619 when the first Africans were brought to the colonies, but this is from anywhere where African people were enslaved in the world or colonized. This is the disadvantage that the colonized or the enslaved has throughout history, because they don't start at the same place as the colonizer. And so even with decolonization, when we talk about decolonization, when we talk about the ending of chattel slavery, that means nothing without any sort of reparations or recompense from the centuries of exploitation. You have to give back everything that was stolen in order for us to move forward as equals. So 1800, the federal government establishes liberal credit privileges in Western territories for buyers in public land at a price of $1 an acre. Slaves not eligible and free blacks generally considered uncreditworthy. 1830, the Federal Preemption Act grants land settlers rights to purchase up to 160 acres, each at $1.25 per acre. The vast majority of blacks are still slaves and ineligible to own property. No evidence of significant participation by free blacks. 1850, the beginning of the massive federal land grant program for private railroad companies, right? We couldn't even get into that business. Outright awards of 130 million acres frequently include property for 20 miles on either side of roadbeds. These lands later found to contain billions of dollars of petroleum and mineral reserves. Black businessmen never considered qualified to acquire, finance, or operate railroad franchises, right? Even free blacks couldn't even participate in this quote unquote free economy, right? So, and that's free blacks. Enslaved, you have millions. 1850, you have somewhere around 3 million enslaved African people throughout this country who weren't able to participate, between 3 million and 4 million. 1862, the Homestead Act grants settlers 160-acre tracts of federal lands without charge. Over 250 acres of public lands transferred almost exclusively to whites in the most important land program in American history. Negro claimants blocked by lynch mobs, intimidation, and refusals of local authorities to protect their claims. It's 1862. 1889. Oh, this is after the Civil War. Over 4 million African people were liberated, quote unquote liberated, because when we look at this, they were relegated to second-class citizens. And as Malcolm X said, there's no such thing as a second-class citizen. You're either free or a slave. So we can say that these people were slaves. So in 1889, in the celebrated Oklahoma land rush, 150,000 white settlers scrambled to claim the choices Savage lynchings, Ku Klux Klan terrorism, and Jim Crow legislation kept Negroes out. Later, the heirs and successors of white settlers were to discover billions of dollars of petroleum resources on these lands. So again, when you see like this terrorism, this exclusion that's taking place, if the federal government isn't protecting the rights of a people, then those people are slaves. If the government is not ensuring your rights, then who are you in that society? You can't say that you're a citizen in that society. In 1920, the Mineral Leasing Act authorizes the federal government to lease public land for the exploration of oil, gas, and other minerals. Affluent Negroes need not apply. Race discrimination of public awards was the established policy of the federal government in the 1920s. 1926, the Federal Air Commerce Act authorizes the granting of monopoly air routes to qualified aviators. The nation airlines are born. 20,000 white pilots learned their trade in the rigidly segregated World War I Army Air Corps, ensuring that the ownership of commercial aviation would be lily white. 1927, the Federal Radio Act authorizes the award of radio station broadcast franchises to private citizens. Under settled policy of the federal government, no grants were made to Negroes. Radio broadcast licenses currently valued in the billions of dollars, now held almost exclusively by whites. 1939, the Federal Communications Commission issues the first licenses for television broadcast stations. No grants made to Negroes until token awards of the late 1970s. In 1980, all television franchises valued at $5 million to $10 billion held exclusively by whites. In 1941, government contracting becomes a major factor in the sales revenues and profits of private enterprises. Race discrimination in government contract awards becomes the official policy of the United States government. During the years 1941 to 1980, approximately $3 trillion in contract awards were made almost exclusively to white-owned firms. Right, so that's not, it stops here in 1941, but this exploitation, these racist policies, right, continue on to this day. There's another a chart here, but I'll look at that. That'll be a to be continue right there, man. But again, just to be clear, like when we get to this point, when we're talking about currently and why Europeans continue to be able to dominate Black people, is because they have, in the building of this economic system, which has been in the making for centuries, it has been built at the exclusion of the masses of African people. And any sort of exclusion that African people have had in the system, it has been some sort of token inclusion, or if they were included, it was because of the benefit that their inclusion, the benefit to Europeans of their inclusion within the system. It's very important to be clear on that. And that's even today, when we look at billionaires, Black billionaires, and Black millionaires, we have to look like, how is this benefiting the white community? And how is it benefiting the Black community, right? And you best believe that most of these people who have this money is because of how it benefits the white community. Under this system, if it's only benefiting Black people, they don't want any parts of it, right? So for them being able to control the means of production and distribution, in order, like these people, Jay-Z, I don't even want to say any names. But there are people who, if you look at circles, like who are they sitting in front of, interviewing, people that they're connecting, these are people who, for the most part, in their social or economic class bracket. And these are mostly people who don't look like us, right? And so it's important, and I think like one of the ways that we can like really overturn this is because it's going to be on us, is that we recognize that and we begin to build our own institutions and support our own institutions. I want to buy Black movement. I want to put them out there. Buy Black movement. Check them out. I wonder if it's .org or .com, but look in Google Buy Black movement. look at them. This could be a platform that we can use to support Black vendors, Black businesses, right? And it has to be more than just buying Black. You know, these Black businesses have to intentionally come into the Black communities and develop a economic system that's going to raise the Black community. We have to be working together because if we're buying Black, but these Black people, put it again, like hip hop, we support hip hop, but if these artists are taking their money and they're spending it with the colonizer, then how is that benefiting the Black community, right? So it's not just about supporting Black people. We have to begin to build relationships and set demands, set parameters. We have to begin as people who consume, as people who are the working class, who are spending our money. We have to begin to sit down and determine collectively, like, how we're going to spend our resources and who we're going to spend our resources with, right? How is spending our resources with a particular business, a corporation, a person, how is that going to benefit the Black community collectively? And if it doesn't, then we need to take our business elsewhere. So with that being said, like, we still reading chapter 2, Bases of Power. This chapter is all about how we need to be able to control bases of power. Those people who control the bases of power are able to control the people who are dependent on those bases of power. So the only basis of power dependency we should have is on ourselves. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is to control bases of power. And for right now, the colonizer controls the life-sustaining institutions, which are bases of power, and we have to overturn that contradiction. All right. So that being said, man, this has been a good morning. Appreciate everybody being a part of this discussion. I see more and more people joining, man. But we're going to do this again. Make sure you subscribe, like, and share. If you're just joining us, you can go to the channel, and this replay will be up. And you can check all the previous podcast that I have done. I think this is number 22 right here. So continue to, tune in, continue to build. And the other important thing, implementation. Read this book, put it into practice wherever you are. Even if you're setting up classes, man, this is a part of the education. This is education right here. So even if you're taking this book and you set up a class with 3 or 4 people, right? These are people who may have been exposed or haven't been exposed to this work. Bring them into consciousness through the reading of this book and begin to talk about ways to implement it. I just want to, all right. And one last thing, Dr. Emerson Wilson, only because, brother Ndugu and Nkrumah wasn't familiar, so I don't want to take that for granted either. And let me just pull one last thing up. All right. So I just want to share a few of the books that he has published. All right. So if you look at my screen, I'm sharing it. He really he speaks on the things that we need to be very conscious of in regards to child rearing, educating our children, building institutions, doing continuing power, whether it's economic institutions, political institutions. For my people, the developmental psychology of the Black child. Right. This is something our teachers we need to have teachers that's trained in these teachings, right? Trained in the development of Black children, but from an African-centered perspective, though. And so reading, and he's just one author. There's other people we should be studying too, but you can see he touches on that. The developmental psychology of the Black child. We have right here, the African-centered consciousness versus the New World Order, Garveyism in the age of globalism. Awakening natural genius of the natural genius of Black children, Dr. Emerson Wilson. The falsification of African consciousness, Eurocentric history, psychiatry, and the politics of white supremacy. What's up? We dealing with violence in the community, understanding Black adolescent male violence. I mean, he touches on this stuff is written in the 80s and the 90s. This book, which I did a podcast on a few times, I'm actually going to bring that back. There has been a request for me to get back to this book, so I will get back to this soon. Black on Black violence, the psychodynamics of Black self-annihilation in service of white domination. Self-hatred, self-defeat. All right, is another one. And let me put this out there for my people. I also have his dissertation. I have Dr. Emerson Wilson's dissertation. Right? I bet you no one on here has read that one. Let me not say that. Some of y'all might have. I have his dissertation though, so we might talk. I might make that available for you guys. But Dr. Emerson Wilson, man, like his work, I think is significant in the fight for liberation. So with that being said, again, I want to say peace to everybody. Thanks for joining. Everybody chat, always Sugar and Kruma, QKR, Anarchist, Stay Balance. Hey, appreciate y'all and everybody else who has joined this discussion. And build with you soon. So I'm gonna say peace, Black Power, continue to struggle. Dare to struggle, dare to win, as Fred Hampton used to say. Peace.